The mountain man who built coffins until she made him laugh again. A reclusive mountain man, who has built coffins for a decade to atone for a past tragedy, has his solitary world upturned by a relentlessly cheerful botanist who refuses to be intimidated by his silence or his sorrow. High in the arms of the mountains, where the air was thin and sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone, there was a man who had become a part of the silence. His name was Silas, and he lived with an echo. Each morning, before the sun could gild the highest peaks, he was already in his workshop. The cabin was a stubborn thing, built of logs worn smooth by decades of wind and snow, and the workshop was its heart. It was here that the only consistent sound in the valley was born, the steady rhythmic chip-chip-chipping of a chisel biting into wood. It was a sound as regular as a heartbeat, a metronome marking the passage of his days. Inside, the air was a thick soup of sawdust and memory. Coffins stood along the walls in various states of completion, a silent, sober assembly line. Some were rough-hewn pine, simple and honest. Others were of polished cedar, their grain rich and deep. To Silas they were not mere boxes, they were vessels. Each one was an atonement, a prayer offered to a God he no longer believed in, for a peace he could not grant himself. His hands, gnarled and strong, mapped with the scars of his trade, moved with a reverent precision. He would run his palm over the interior of a finished coffin, feeling for any imperfection, any hint of roughness. It had to be smooth. It had to be perfect. For whom, he never asked himself. It was simply the rule of his life, the unbreakable ritual. On a high shelf, shrouded in a fine gray dust, sat the ghost of another man. It was a small wooden lark, carved from a piece of maple, its wings swept back as if caught in mid-flight, its tiny beak open in a silent, eternal song. It was a masterpiece of delicate joy, a relic from a time when his hands carved life, not death. He never looked at it directly, but it was always there in his periphery, a splinter in his soul. The day's work done, he carried a simple, unvarnished cross outside. Behind the cabin, in a small clearing bathed in the last of the afternoon light, was a garden of stones. Two stood apart from the rest. One older, its granite face softened by lichen red alara. The other, smaller, a stark white marble red lark. He knelt, not in prayer but in attendance. He placed the new cross at the foot of a fresh mound of earth, a trapper from the valley who had fallen through the ice. Silas had built his coffin as he did for all who had no one else. He had not known the man, but he knew his grief. He knew the shape of the hole left behind. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, he stood and looked from the new grave to the old ones. Ilara, whose laughter had once filled these silent woods until a swift and ruthless fever stole her breath. And Lark, their daughter. His little bird. Her loss was a different kind of fracture, a cataclysm that had shattered the world itself. He remembered the sound of her laughter, a bright, trilling thing that had once been the true music of this valley. He remembered the awful, crushing silence that followed the accident on the mountain, a fall where she had simply flown too close to the sun. He had found her. He had built her coffin. His hands, which had carved a wooden lark for her 5th birthday, had planed the wood for her final bed. That was the day the music in him had died, replaced by the sound of wood being shaped for the dead. A promise was made then, a vow whispered into the unforgiving mountain air. He would never laugh again. He would never seek joy. He would become the warden of his own grief, and he would build his coffins, one after another, as a monument to what was lost and a shield against the unbearable pain of feeling anything ever again. The wind picked up, sighing through the pines. It was a lonely sound, but it was a sound he understood. It was the sound of the world, empty. He turned his back on the graves and walked towards the dark shape of his cabin, the chip-chip-chipping silent until the dawn, leaving only the vast, listening quiet of the mountain. The silence of the valley was a settled thing, as deep and ancient as the stone beneath the soil. For 10 years, it had been broken only by the sounds Silas allowed, the crack of axe on wood, the whisper of a plane on cedar, the mournful cry of a hawk. It was a curated quiet, a sanctuary built from sorrow. Then a new sound came. A vulgar, grinding roar that clawed at the peace of the morning. Silas, who was fitting a lid for a coffin of black walnut, froze. His chisel hovered mid-strike. The sound was wrong, a mechanical, gasoline-fed intruder. It was the sound of the world below, the world he had left behind, and it was coming up his mountain. He set the chisel down with a quiet, deliberate click. He did not rush. He moved to the window of his workshop, a shadow among shadows, and looked down the winding track that served as his driveway. A vehicle, a boxy, once green 4x4 now caked in dust and mud, was lurching and groaning its way upward. It was an alien thing in this landscape, belching noise and disruption. It hit a particularly deep rut, the engine whined in protest, and with a final, pathetic shudder, it stalled. The sudden return of silence felt louder than the noise had been. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the driver's door swung open with a metallic screech. Out stepped a woman. She was a splash of color against the muted greens and browns of the forest. A wild mane of red hair, escaping from a messy bun, seemed to capture the morning light. She wore practical trousers and boots, but her jacket was a bright, impossible cobalt blue. She put her hands on her hips, surveyed her stalled vehicle, and instead of cursing, she let out a bright, clear laugh that echoed faintly against the hillsides. "Well, legs it is," she announced to the silent trees, her voice carrying easily to Silas's cabin. He watched, motionless, as she shouldered a heavy pack, grabbed a large duffel bag, and began the trudge up the path with a determined, energetic stride. She didn't look defeated, she looked invigorated by the challenge. Silas retreated from the window and positioned himself in the doorway of his workshop, a sentinel at his gate. He crossed his arms, his large frame blocking the entrance. He was the mountain itself, and he would not be moved. Soon she was there, slightly out of breath, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. Her eyes, a lively, intelligent green, scanned the cabin, the woodpile, the workshop, and finally found him. They held no fear, only a frank and open curiosity. "Hello," she called, her voice cheerful. "Mr. Holloway? I'm Cora Lee, the botanist. The Forestry Service said you wouldn't mind if I camped nearby while I survey the alpine forget-me-nots." She said it as if it were the most reasonable request in the world, as if a dozen people a week traipsed through his personal purgatory to look at flowers. Silas said nothing. His gaze was a physical pressure. Cora's smile didn't falter, but it became a little more fixed. She hefted her duffel bag. "I brought jam. As a thank you. It's raspberry." She held out the jar like a peace offering, its red contents glowing like a jewel in the mountain light. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. A jay scolded from a nearby pine. Silas made no move to take the jar. His eyes, the color of a frozen lake, remained locked on her. He was trying to wither her, to make her understand through sheer force of will that she was not welcome, that her presence was a tear in the fabric of his existence. Cora slowly lowered the jar, her cheer finally beginning to fray at the edges. She took in the hard line of his jaw, the deep sorrow etched into the lines around his eyes, the way he stood as if rooted to the spot. "Right," she said, her voice softer now, losing its performative brightness. "Strong, silent type. Got it." Her eyes flickered past him into the dim workshop, taking in the ranks of coffins. A flicker of understanding, of pity, passed through her gaze. It was the one thing he could not abide. "I'll just be over there," she said, nodding toward a flat clearing a few hundred yards away ringed by aspens. "Not bothering you." She gave a small, awkward wave, then turned and walked away, her bright blue jacket a blasphemous flag moving through his territory. He watched her until she reached the clearing and dropped her bags, then he turned on his heel. He stepped back into the cool darkness of his workshop. The scent of wood, his constant companion, now seemed disturbed. He picked up his mallet and chisel. He selected a stubborn knot in a piece of oak. And he began to work again. Chip, chip, chip. The sound was no longer a rhythm. It was a weapon. Each strike was sharper, harder, more forceful than before, driving the new, unwelcome silence, the one her voice had left behind, out of his sanctuary. He was carving a coffin, yes, but in that moment he was also building his walls higher, tamping down the earth around his heart, trying to bury the faint, unsettling echo of a laugh that had, for one brief moment, touched the air. The mountain had its own rhythms, and Silas knew them all. The slow creep of dawn mist, the afternoon sun warming the southern rock face, the evening chorus of crickets. These were predictable, orderly. Cora Lee was not. She was a new, chaotic weather pattern, and she had settled in the clearing like a persistent, brightly colored fog. Her presence was a constant, low-grade disturbance in the force field of Silas's solitude. He could not step outside without some evidence of her. The blue flicker of her jacket through the trees, the drift of her voice as she talked to her plants, the occasional, maddeningly cheerful whistle. For 3 days he tried to outwait her, to outsilence her. He buried himself in his work, the thump-thump-thump of his mallet a declaration of his unwillingness to engage. But Cora, it seemed, did not require engagement. She was a self-contained system of conversation. On the 4th day, as he was splitting firewood near the woodpile, she appeared, munching on an apple. "You know," she began, as if resuming a conversation they'd been having, The tensile strength of that cedar is quite remarkable. Nature's perfect polymer. It's all about the longitudinal alignment of the tracheids. Silas brought the axe down. Crack. The log split cleanly in two. He did not look at her. Right? Cora said, taking another loud bite of apple. Well, carry on. She wandered off, but the silence she left behind now felt different. It felt listened to. The next day she simply sat on a stump near his workshop, not too close but not far enough. She had a notebook in her lap and was sketching. She talked, not to him but to the air around him, a steady one-sided stream of consciousness. And my thesis advisor said, Cora, no one cares about the symbiotic relationship between moss and granite, and I said, well, I care and the granite probably does too. It's not a one-sided relationship. The moss provides chemical weathering, and the granite provides a stable substrate. It's a partnership. Silas was sanding the edge of a coffin lid, his movements slow and deliberate. He focused on the grit of the sandpaper, the feel of the wood grain becoming smooth under his palm. But her words were like water dripping on stone. He heard about her disastrous attempt at baking sourdough. I created a new species of brick. Her fascination with cloud formations, her theory that squirrels were the true rulers of the forest. He made no sign of hearing. But once, when she described her cat's hilarious battle with a rolled-up piece of paper, a strange thing happened. A sound, a mere puff of air, escaped his nose. It wasn't a laugh. It was the ghost of a laugh, a fossil of amusement. A corresponding twitch, a tiny seismic crack, appeared near his eye. He froze, his sanding hand stopping mid-stroke. He was horrified. It was a betrayal. A betrayal of Ilara, of Lark, of his promise. He looked up, his face a thundercloud, expecting to see triumph in her eyes. But Cora wasn't looking at him. She was gazing out at the mountain, a soft, remembering smile on her face as she finished her story. She had not seen his moment of weakness. The relief was so acute it felt like shame. Then the weather turned. It began in the afternoon, a sudden bruising of the sky. The wind, once gentle, began to whip the trees into a frenzy. Silas felt the familiar pressure drop in his bones. This was no passing shower, this was a mountain storm, a true tempest. He secured his shutters and watched from his window. In the clearing, Cora's bright blue tent was a tiny, flimsy thing. It billowed and strained, a sail about to be torn from its moorings. He saw her, a small figure fighting with the guy lines, her red hair whipping across her face like wildfire. The first fat, cold raindrops began to fall, hitting the roof like stones. A war waged within him. Let her be. She made her choice. She would get cold, wet, miserable. She would leave. He saw a gust of wind lift the entire tent, with her still inside, and slam it back down. He heard her faint, startled yelp. A memory, unbidden and sharp. Lark, caught in a sudden downpour on a trail, her small hand slipping into his. "It's okay, Papa. We're tough, right?" With a grunt of pure irritation, he snatched a heavy wool blanket from a chest and marched out into the lashing wind. He didn't say a word. He just appeared at the edge of her collapsing camp. Cora was on her hands and knees, desperately trying to peg down the flapping nylon, soaked to the skin and shivering. Silas reached down, grabbed the strap of her duffel bag and jerked his head toward the cabin. Cora looked up, rain streaming down her face. For a moment she just stared, shocked out of her usual chatter. Then understanding dawned. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning the tent, and followed him as he strode back to the cabin. Inside he tossed the blanket at her. He pointed to the small rustic cot near the large stone fireplace. It was the one Ilara had sometimes used for afternoon naps. His meaning was clear: stay there. Don't move. He turned to stoke the fire, building it into a roaring blaze, his back to her. Cora stood dripping on his floor, wrapped in the scratchy wool. Her eyes, wide and grateful, moved around the room. It was Spartan, masculine, but lovingly maintained. And then she saw it. On the mantelpiece, next to a simple clay mug, was the wooden lark. Her breath caught. It was exquisite. The carving was fluid, joyful, achingly detailed. It spoke of an artist's soul, a world away from the man who built functional, somber coffins. Her eyes moved from the bird to Silas's broad, rigid back. The contradiction was a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She didn't touch it. She didn't even step closer. But she spoke, her voice soft, stripped of its usual buoyancy, meant only for the space between them. Someone who carves a bird like that. She murmured, almost to herself. They must have known joy once. In the silence of the cabin, with the storm raging a symphony against the roof, the words landed not as an intrusion, but as a simple, devastating truth. Silas, kneeling before the fire, went perfectly still. The poker in his hand hovered over a glowing log. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. But in the sudden tension of his shoulders, in the way his head bowed just a fraction of an inch, Cora saw it. She had not just stepped into his cabin. She had, without meaning to, touched the very nerve of his grief. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. The air held a sharp, crystalline quality, and the mountains seemed closer, their details etched with impossible clarity. But inside Silas's cabin, the atmosphere remained thick with the unspoken words from the night before. Cora had left at first light, with a quiet "thank you for the shelter," before retreating to survey her sodden camp. Silas had merely grunted in response, already at his workbench, seeking solace in the familiar grip of a chisel. He worked with a feverish intensity, as if he could carve away the memory of her voice, her pity, her perception. They must have known joy once. The words echoed in the spaces between the strikes of his mallet. They were an accusation. A reminder of the man he had deliberately buried, a man whose hands could conjure a singing bird from a block of wood. That man was a stranger to him now, a ghost he had long since stopped feeding. He decided to check his trapline along the eastern ridge, a need for distance, for the pure, uncomplicated silence of the high places. The path took him down toward the chattering stream that fed the valley. He moved with the quiet grace of a creature born to these woods, his boots making almost no sound on the damp earth. It was there by the stream that he found her. Cora was perched on a moss-slicked boulder that jutted out over the water, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, her head bent in concentration. She was so absorbed she didn't hear his approach. For a long moment, Silas stood hidden among the pines, watching her. She was sketching a cluster of tiny blue-flowered plants clinging to the rock face. Her face was a study of focused contentment, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth. Then it happened. Shifting her weight to get a better angle, her boots slipped on the wet moss. Her arms pinwheeled in a frantic, comical arc. The sketchbook flew from her grasp, landing with a soft plop in the shallows. With a final, undignified yelp, she followed it, tumbling sideways into the knee-deep, ice-cold water. The splash was tremendous. Silas's body reacted before his mind could. He burst from the tree line, his heart lurching into his throat, a dozen grim scenarios flashing through his mind. A cracked skull on a hidden rock, a broken limb. He skidded to a halt at the water's edge. Cora was sitting in the stream, soaked from the waist down, her hair plastered to her forehead. For a second she just sat there stunned. Then she looked down at her floating sketchbook, at her waterlogged trousers, and a sound bubbled up from her chest. It wasn't a groan of frustration or a cry of pain. It was a laugh. It started as a disbelieving chuckle and then bloomed into a full, rich, unbridled peal of laughter that rang off the surrounding stones. She slapped the surface of the water with her palm, sending up a spray of droplets. "I was trying to identify the water speedwell," she gasped between breaths, her shoulders shaking, "and it identified me as a fool." She laughed harder, the sound so genuine, so utterly devoid of self-pity, that it was disorienting. She looked up at him, her eyes crinkled with mirth, her face alight with the sheer absurdity of the moment. And Silas, who had braced for tragedy, who was still coiled with adrenaline, felt the rigid tension in his chest snap. A sound erupted from him. It was rough and used more of a sharp guttural exhalation than a laugh, a staccato ha, that ripped through the quiet like a gunshot. The moment it left his lips, the world froze. Cora's laughter cut off instantly. Her eyes widened, her mouth forming a perfect O of shock. She stared at him as if he had just sprouted wings. Silas took a physical step back as if the sound had recoiled from him. His own hand came up to his mouth, his fingers touching his lips as if to confirm the betrayal. The feeling that had accompanied the sound, a fleeting foreign sensation of levity, was now a sickening warmth spreading through him, followed immediately by a cold, clamping shame. He saw the dawning wonder on Cora's face, the beginnings of a triumphant smile. "Was that?" she whispered, her voice full of awe. "Did you just?" No. The word did not leave his mouth, but it screamed in his eyes. The shutters behind his gaze slammed down. The fleeting light that had, for one impossible second, flickered in their winter-gray depths, was extinguished. His face hardened into a mask more severe than any she had seen before. It was not just silence now, it was a fortress raising its drawbridge. Without a word, without even helping her from the water, he turned on his heel. His retreat was not a walk, it was a flight. He crashed back through the undergrowth, his movements stiff and angry, leaving Cora sitting alone in the cold stream, the ghost of his laugh hanging in the air between them, already beginning to dissolve. Workshop, night. That night, the sound coming from the workshop was not the rhythmic chip-chip-chipping of a craftsman. It was the furious, relentless scraping of a man trying to erase his own skin. Silas was sanding a coffin lid with a brutal, wasted energy, the grit of the sandpaper tearing at the wood grain rather than smoothing it. The memory of that sound, his sound, played on a loop in his mind. It felt like a vomit of the soul, a sacrilege. His eyes lifted from his work, drawn against his will to the high shelf. The wooden lark seemed to mock him in the flickering lamplight. It was no longer just a symbol of lost joy, it was now an accuser, a witness to his momentary capitulation. He remembered carving it for Lark. He remembered her small hands reaching for it, her delighted gasp, the way she had made it fly around the room, providing its song with her own tiny, perfect voice. The memory was a physical blow. He slammed his fist down on the workbench. The mallet, the chisels, the jars of nails, everything rattled and jumped with the force of it. The echo of the crash died away, leaving a silence that was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. He stood there, chest heaving, staring at the bird. He had not just betrayed his vow of silence. He had betrayed them. By laughing even for a second he was forgetting. And forgetting was the ultimate betrayal. He would not let it happen again. He would build the walls higher. He would make the silence deeper. He would remind himself, with every coffin he built, why joy was a currency he could no longer afford. The second storm arrived not with a gradual bruising of the sky, but with a sudden, violent tear. One moment the world was still and heavy, the air tasting of ozone and damp earth. The next, a wind like a battering ram slammed into the cabin, and the heavens split open. This was not the blizzard of before. This was a spring fury, a torrential downpour that turned the world into a roaring, chaotic drum. Inside, the cabin felt like the last lit ship on a black, raging sea. The fire in the hearth, which Silas had built to a defiant roar, spat and hissed as wind-driven rain found its way down the chimney. The windows rattled in their frames, and the sound on the roof was a continuous, deafening cannonade. Silas and Cora sat in the heart of the tumult, separated by only a few feet of floorboards, yet divided by a decade of silence. He was in his worn rocking chair, staring into the flames as if reading his past in the coals. She was on the floor, leaning against the cot, wrapped in the same wool blanket, her knees drawn to her chest. The usual, easy chatter she wielded like a shield was gone. The storm had stolen it, replacing it with a respectful quiet. She simply waited, her presence a steady, patient thing in the chaotic room. An hour passed, marked only by the frantic ticking of the wind-up clock on the mantel. Then Silas's voice, when it came, was so low and rough it seemed to be woven from the storm itself. "You don't have to tell me." Cora looked up, startled. It was the first time he had initiated speech. He continued, his eyes still locked on the fire. "But you should know. I'm not afraid of other people's storms." It was an offering. A key held out in the palm of his hand. Silas was silent for so long she thought he had retreated back into his fortress. He rocked slowly, the creak of the wood a familiar, lonely sound beneath the storm's scream. He looked from the flames to the empty rocking chair across from him. The one he had made for Alara. The one no one had sat in since. When he began again, his voice was a rusty hinge, forcing itself to move after years of stillness. Her name was Alara. The name hung in the air, sacred and fragile. She filled rooms. He gestured vaguely, a slow, sweeping motion with his hand. Not with noise. With light. She could walk into a clearing and the sun would seem to follow her. His eyes flickered to Cora's, then away as if the memory was too bright to look at directly. That was her chair. She'd sit there mending clothes, humming. Always humming. He took a long, shaky breath, the sound raw in the quiet of the cabin. The storm seemed to have hushed just for him. "Our daughter?" He stopped, his throat working. The words were stones he had to dislodge from his soul. "We called her Lark. For her laugh. It was the same. A trill. Like the bird. You'd hear it from across the meadow and it was like the world was new." He fell silent again, gathering the strength for the descent. Cora didn't move, didn't breathe for fear of breaking the spell. The sickness took Alara fast. 1 week she was here, the next. He shook his head, the rest of the sentence lost in the unspeakable void. "It was just me and Lark after that. My little bird." His hands, resting on his knees, clenched into white-knuckled fists. The story was turning, the light fading from it. "She loved the mountain. Knew it better than I did sometimes. She was fearless. A single bitter tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the sawdust on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. There was a climb. A place she'd been 100 times. I was working, always working. She said she'd be back by supper. His voice dropped to a shattered whisper. A rock gave way. They said it was quick. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that swallowed the storm's rage. He was back there on the mountainside finding her. The memory was a fresh wound, torn open after years of festering. I built her coffin, he said, the words flat, final. I built my daughter's coffin. With these hands. He held them up, staring at them as if they were foreign, murderous things. I carved her name on the lid. I made it smooth. So smooth. He looked at Cora then, his gaze hollow, full of a pain so vast it had its own gravity. I build them for the town. For travelers. For anyone. So no one else has to, so no father has to build one for his child. He dropped his hands, the fight gone out of them. I promised I wouldn't feel anything again. It was easier. Cora's own face was wet with silent tears. She didn't offer platitudes. There were none. She simply let his grief fill the room, a tangible, shared thing. After a long time, when the storm had softened to a steady rain, her voice was a gentle, sure thing in the darkness. Easier, she whispered, isn't the same as living, Silas. The sound of his name on her lips, spoken not as a question or a formality, but as a simple acknowledgement of his existence, of his pain, was the final stone removed from the wall. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just bowed his head, and for the first time in 10 years, he let the silence hold him instead of him holding the silence. The storm outside was passing, but the one inside him had just truly begun to break. The storm had washed more than just the earth clean. In the days that followed, a new, tentative quality settled over the mountain and over Silas. The silence between him and Cora was no longer a wall, but a bridge. It was a shared space, comfortable and often unbroken, but now it was filled with a new understanding. The air in the cabin no longer felt charged with resistance, but with a fragile, mutual peace. Spring began to assert itself in earnest. The last stubborn patches of snow retreated to the highest shadows, and the meadow below the cabin erupted in a carpet of green, studded with the brave blue heads of the very flowers Cora had come to find. The world was waking up, and something in Silas was stirring in sympathy. He still built his coffins. The rhythm of his work was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. But the frantic, angry energy was gone. The chip-chip-chipping was once again measured, purposeful, almost meditative. He would work for hours and Cora would be nearby, not chattering, not intruding, just being. She would stack the firewood he split, her movements efficient and strong. She would sit on the porch steps, mending a tear in her pack with neat, precise stitches. One afternoon, she decided the woodshed roof needed patching after the storm's abuse. Silas watched from his workshop door as she wrestled the long, rickety ladder into place, a bundle of cedar shingles slung over her shoulder. He made a move to help, but she waved him off. I've got it. Can't be a delicate flower and a field botanist, she'd called down, her voice bright. He stayed in the doorway, a faint, unconscious frown of concern on his face as she climbed. He was watching her hands, her footing, the way the ladder wobbled slightly. He was so attuned to potential disaster, to the way a single moment could shatter a life. Then it happened. Her boot slipped on a damp shingle. Her arms pinwheeled in that same frantic, comical windmill he had seen by the stream. His breath caught. But this time there was no splash, no fall. With a theatrical, squawking noise, she windmilled her arms wildly, her body swaying precariously before she somehow regained her balance. One foot planted firmly, the other kicking out behind her for counterweight. She froze in that ridiculous, triumphant pose, one hand gripping the roof ridge, the other flung out wide. "Ta-da!" she proclaimed, her voice ringing with mock grandeur. "The grace of a mountain goat." And Silas laughed. It was not the sharp, guttural exhalation from the stream. This was a real laugh. Short, surprised, and genuine. A deep, rumbling sound that started in his chest and escaped before he could think to stop it. It was the sound of a boulder, long lodged in a river, finally being shifted by the current. The sound shocked them both. He clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide, not with horror this time, but with wonder. He looked at her as if she had performed a magic trick. Cora's triumphant pose melted away. She slowly climbed down the ladder, her eyes never leaving his face. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away, her expression soft and utterly devoid of gloating. There was only a profound, gentle joy. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say, "It's okay." She simply looked at the man standing before her, the ghost of that true unforced laugh still lingering in the air between them, and she smiled a brilliant, sunshine-filled smile. "There he is," she whispered. Later, in the quiet of the workshop, Silas did not go to the pine board destined for a coffin. Instead, he went to a small locked chest in the corner. With a key he hadn't used in a decade, he opened it. Inside were not tools of death, but tools of life. Fine-gauge carving chisels, tiny files, sheets of delicate sandpaper. They smelled of linseed oil and disuse. He took them to his bench. He selected a small block of cherry wood, its grain tight and promising. He did not sketch. The shape was already in his hands, in his muscles, a memory waiting to be awakened. He began to carve. The focus was the same intense, all-consuming concentration he applied to his coffins, but the energy was different. It was lighter. It was not about containing death, but about releasing life. The delicate slivers of wood that curled away from his tool were not shavings of grief, but promises. He worked for hours, the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth, just as he had seen Cora do by the stream. He paused only to pick up the dusty wooden lark from the shelf. He didn't put it away in the chest. He didn't hide it. He simply dusted it off with a clean rag, oiled it lightly, and set it beside his new project. The old song and the new sitting side by side on his workbench. A past he could finally honor without being crushed by it, and a future he was, for the first time, daring to shape with his own hands. The forget-me-nots had been counted, pressed, and meticulously noted. Cora's duffel bag, once a chaotic explosion of gear in the clearing, now sat packed and zipped by the door of Silas's cabin. The 4x4, coaxed back to life and now pointed downhill, hummed a low, waiting note. The air was thick with the unsaid, the sweet, painful ache of a temporary farewell. Silas stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching her. He had grown accustomed to the splash of her blue jacket in his periphery, the sound of her voice weaving through the sounds of his work. The silence that was now returning felt different. It was no longer a refuge but an absence. "The Forestry Service is going to be very happy," Cora said, her voice a little too bright. She leaned against the car door. "The forget-me-nots are thriving. More than they'd hoped." Silas nodded. The old easy silence between them now felt fragile, threatened by the finality of the running engine. Cora's smile was brave, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I have to go back. Defend my thesis. Tell the world about the moss and the granite." Silas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the determination in the set of her jaw, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose from days in the sun. He saw the woman who had refused to be frightened by his grief. "They should listen," he said. The words, simple and direct, were more potent than any poetry. They were his blessing. Cora's brave smile wavered, a sheen of tears glazing her eyes for a moment before she blinked them away. "I'll send you a copy. It's very exciting." The lie was a gentle one, an attempt to coat the parting in mundane details. She moved to open the car door, the moment of departure upon them. Her courage faltered. She turned back, her hand on the handle, her shoulders slumping. "Silas, she began, the words catching. What could she say? "I'll miss you?" It felt too small for the canyon his story had carved in her soul. "Thank you for letting me in?" It felt like a dismissal of the gift he had given her. He didn't let her finish. He stepped forward, off the porch and into the space between them. He held out his closed fist, then turned it over and opened his palm. There, resting on his work-roughened skin, was the wooden lark. It was freshly oiled, the maple grain glowing like captured honey, every feather on its wings rendered with a love that made her heart ache. "So you don't forget," he said, his voice low and steady. Tears did fall then, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against his palm. The touch was electric, a current that spoke of connection, of a shared history however brief. But he wasn't done. He opened his other hand. In it lay the new carving he had been secretly working on. It was an alpine forget-me-not, so perfect and intricate it seemed a miracle of nature itself. Each of the 5 tiny petals was paper-thin, the center a delicate burst of carved stamens. The stem was slender, the leaves veined with an impossible delicacy. It was the flower she had come for, rendered in eternal loving detail by the hands of a man rediscovering his art. "And so I remember," he whispered. Cora took the flower, her fingers closing around its delicate form. She looked from the lark to the flower, then back to his face, and she understood. He wasn't just giving her trinkets. He was giving her promises. The lark was his past, his joy, which he was now entrusting to her. The flower was her present, her work, which he was now vowing to hold in his memory. They were a pact. She could no longer speak. She nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and carefully placed the carvings in the breast pocket of her jacket, right over her heart. She got into the car. The engine roared, a vulgar sound in the quiet clearing. She looked at him one last time through the open window. "I'll be back," she said, and this time her voice was sure, filled with the same iron will that had carried her up the mountain. "These mountains, they get under your skin." He gave a single, slow nod. "I know." She put the car in gear and began to descend. Silas stood and watched, a solitary figure once more as the 4x4 bumped down the track, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a dust plume against the green of the valley, and then nothing. The silence returned. But it was not the same. It was not empty. It was filled with the memory of a laugh, the ghost of a conversation, the weight of two small carvings now traveling down the mountain. He turned and walked back into his workshop. The scent of wood greeted him as it always had. He looked at the coffins, the tools of his penance. Then his eyes fell on his workbench. He picked up a fresh block of cherry wood, its grain warm and promising. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its potential. He did not reach for the plans for a coffin. Instead, he picked up a pencil and began to sketch the graceful, curving lines of a birdhouse. Later, as the sun bled its last light over the peaks, he walked to the small garden of stones. He placed a single fresh-picked wildflower on each of the two graves. He did not speak of loss or of promises kept. He simply stood there, a man no longer fighting the tide of his own heart. The wind moved through the pines, a soft, sighing breath. And for a moment, if one listened closely, it did not sound like a sigh at all, but like the clear, hopeful note of a lark beginning its song again.